All right, everyone. Well, welcome to this conversation on anti-racism and urbanism. So YIMBY Action and the San Mateo County LatinX Democratic Club partnered to bring us this event. And YIMBY Action is a network of pro-housing activists fighting for more inclusive housing policies. And the San Mateo County LatinX Democratic Club is focused on closing the gap of representation on boards, commissions, councils, getting more Latinos elected to office, and also increasing engagement with the Latinx community in the census, elections, and relevant issues like what we're going to talk about today in housing. So my name is Rudy Espinoza Murray, and it's my privilege to serve as YIMBY Action's new Director of Marketing, but also the Vice President of San Mateo County Latinx Dems. So if what you hear today resonates with you, please consider becoming a member at yimbyaction.org. We're going to be sharing that link in the chat. So YIMBY Action launched a series of conversations in an exercise to take to heart racial justice. So our hope is that we can elevate these ideas and practices that will help us reimagine how we shape cities and how we create that change that's very much needed. So we hope that this series can help us explore the concept of anti-racism and urbanism. How can the policies of urbanism become a force that tears down institutional racism and reduces the racial wealth gap? How does the urbanist movement address its own history and current participation in upholding white supremacy? We won't answer all these questions today, but we hope that we're gonna get you started down this path. So I want to introduce our guest today, Sara Bronin, founder of Desegregate Connecticut, and she has an incredible resume of experience and education. She's a professor, an architect, and a lawyer, attended the University of Texas, Oxford, and Yale Law School. Desegregate Connecticut emerged in June of 2020 during a period of rising public awareness about inequities in our society as exposed by the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racial injustice. So I want to pass it off to Laura Foote, Executive Director of YIMBY Action, who will lead today's conversation. Laura.
Thanks so much, Rudy. I am really excited about this conversation in particular. I got into this, one of the first reasons why I got so interested in housing is my high school was one of the first integrated schools in the DC area. And it was founded by parents who wanted their kids to go to a mixed race school when that was illegal. And this idea of actually we need to do a lot more to desegregate our communities. We need to do so much more to desegregate our housing policies, and that we have policies that are continuing to reinforce them is something that I am totally obsessed with. I care about the climate aspects of the housing justice movement, but what really gets me animated is thinking about the ways in which our policies reinforce segregation. And Sara in Connecticut has been doing just a really kind of incredible job putting to the forefront this idea that we have policies that are perpetuating segregation and that we actually have to do active work to tear down those walls. So Sara, tee up your work for everyone so that they can understand kind of how you guys are tackling this problem.
Yeah, so first, Rudy and Laura and both of your organizations and everybody who's on the call, thanks so much for having me, beaming in from Hartford, Connecticut. I live downtown in Hartford, which is one of Connecticut's large cities at 125,000 people. It's probably a tiny suburb in most of your large cities, but in Connecticut, it's one of the biggest, the capital city too. And I kind of raised the point of where I am now to emphasize the vast separation within Connecticut amongst our different towns. So as Rudy said, I'm a law professor, architect. I really care deeply about cities and places. And it's not hard to see living in a city like Hartford, which is a very low income city for people who don't know, which is 15% white city and is nestled in a sea of very wealthy suburban towns, one of the wealthiest regions in the country. And the differences here, depending on your zip code, really dictate your health outcomes, your educational opportunities, your economic opportunities, and your chance for intergenerational wealth. And it shouldn't be that way. We should have an amazing city of Hartford, which we do. We should make it even better. And we should also make sure that people have choices as to where they live. So really, Connecticut is a great place to think about these issues and to try to work in them, because of the vast gaps that are so obvious and that are actually so easily fixable by policy. And I should say too, I'm not, don't come to this as an affordable housing advocate. I'm a good zoning advocate. And so part of what we've been able to do with Desegregate Connecticut is bring together not only the longtime hardworking affordable housing advocacy community across our state, but also new players to the game, into this conversation, and to reform, because we've been able to kind of take the housing piece, which is so important, and broaden the appeal in the way that Laura was suggesting, environment and economic development as well in that mix. So that's just a basic primer as to where we are and why I'm involved.
And for those who are sort of new to the concept of zoning and how it perpetuates segregation, you guys have done, and I love the sort of like interactive map on your website of helping people think about how their town's policies are exacerbating segregation. Can you help people understand kind of how those two things are so interconnected?
Yeah, so if you liked the map on our website now, I think early next week we'll be posting a new map on our website that shows all 2,618 zoning districts in the state on one map, and also all of their housing characteristics. So it'll be the first time any place has done that. But probably more important is the first question, which is, what does zoning do and how does it affect outcomes? So zoning is regulation of land use, structures and lots by dividing a municipality or a jurisdiction, sometimes a county, into districts. So a zone code will assign a piece of land, a district. It'll designate the land into a certain district, and the district will have certain characteristics. So a housing district that is called, let's say, a 1 acre single family district will require single family housing on large 1 acre lots. Multifamily district or a mixed use district might require something else. So zoning dictates where housing can happen. It also dictates what kind of housing there is, the kind of lot size, other characteristics. And so it really dictates really the very structure of our society, and has a huge influence on our economy and, again, people's access to opportunities, because it really says in zoning regulations, it does lock in prices, and it locks in opportunity, and sometimes locks out opportunities.
Yeah, and I think one thing that YIMBYs are obsessed with zoning. That's like the thing that we talk about all the time, and trying to find new ways to talk about zoning to make it less wonky and help people understand that connection of like, this is deciding what kind of community you can have, because we're going to be blocking multifamily apartment buildings. Therefore, we're going to be deliberately saying the kinds of people who live in multifamily apartment buildings are not going to be able to live here, and the impact that that has on access to opportunity, access to jobs, how it's pushing people further and further out from the places where, high performing school districts, all of those things that people want. If you make the kind of housing that is more accessible to them illegal, they cannot get access to that community. That's like, I don't want to say like it's like all we talk about all the time. I hope it's not getting boring. It's like a thing we're totally obsessed with. The angle that you guys are taking of really putting first and foremost that this is about segregation and perpetuating segregation, and are we going to desegregate, is, I think, key insight for people. Do you find that, I think when we're going out, and especially like suburban communities that don't want to allow different kinds of people into their community, they have a lot of different reasons why, and they have a lot of different ways of talking about it. Do you find that like framing this as perpetuating segregation, how does that help you have a conversation with people? Because like, I'm so curious. YIMBY is already esoteric. You're going into communities and you're saying like, I want you to desegregate. How does that conversation go?
Yeah, the naming question is a very interesting one. As Rudy said, we really started in June as a coalition, and we have 55 organizational members. In fact, just this morning we got news from the Carpenters Union saying that they were signing on as a member of our coalition, which is awesome. Thank you, Carpenters. So it's a very broad-ranging coalition. And we actually picked the name very early in our second meeting. In fact, I did not even know that this was going to be what it was when we started meeting in June. But it just built upon itself, and people really started getting engaged. I think because of the name at first, to say, wow, like this is really, it's kind of telling it like it is. And the truth is that Connecticut is an extremely segregated state. Not everybody believes that in Connecticut. And so when some communities do hear, some people do hear desegregate, they think, oh gosh, are these, crazy radicals going to try to overrun my neighborhood with, those people. In a way, we have an FAQ on our website because people ask us, why did you choose this name? So we answered, this is why we chose this name. We're sort of calling it like it is. But at the same time, we recognize it does ruffle feathers. Now that we've continued to evolve over time and gain coalition members, we're taking equity at our core, but we're also adding in really two major complementary concerns or goals, which is economic equity and economic growth. Inclusive growth is how we're calling it, as well as environmental growth. And the obvious, the environment and housing have so much in common, and they really go hand in hand. Good environmental policies are good housing policies. Making more housing where development already happens is really the smartest thing that we can do. And it, of course, protects us from building further and further outward into forests and farmland. So that's all to say, yes, our name has ruffled some feathers, but at the same time, I think as we've evolved, people see that it's a very broad tent. But the intent and the passion of almost everybody who's been a core member of our movement is about the core of it, which is equity and just trying to make sure that all of our communities and all of our people have access, period.
No, I think it's a great name. I mean, I think, sometimes I regret that we went with YIMBY, which I think is, we got to define it, but also that meant that other people, it's like not a word that's familiar to people. So how much did they get to define us too? And like, it's a fight over a definition of a new concept. And what I really like about desegregate is that, yeah, you're going to ruffle feathers, but they're going to be the right feathers. You're sort of, you're putting your flag down pretty early about what are your goals, and forcing people to react to that.
And I should say, we also recognize that that this really zoning reform has never been a hot button issue in Connecticut. Nobody's ever really, of course, advocates have asked for things at the margins, but nobody's really ever said, here's a package of reforms that together will really make a difference. And what we're proposing this year is really, a package of reforms that won't by themselves magically desegregate Connecticut, right? It's not just some zoning reforms, but it's also everything else that goes along with it. It's also funding, it's also attitudes. We've been to so many communities and people are very willing to have these conversations now when they might not have been a year ago. So that's really great. But I mean, I should say, that should be the goal. That is our goal. But, will any one policy do it? Of course not. There's so many other things that go along with it. So you have to think about it as a whole package.
It does seem like across the country that we're really at the beginning of this tipping point where so many communities are having real conversations about zoning in a way that, when we started 5 years ago, it was just, there were a few nerds who were like very passionate about it. But now it really feels like you can feel this like opening to this national conversation about how zoning, especially perpetuates segregation and is, and then you can get into like stunting an entire generation and, exacerbating greenhouse gas emissions, that people are talking about it in this multifaceted way. Whether you're talking about the, Sacramento just passed zoning reform as part of their housing element process that eliminated single family home only zoning. That was really exciting. I'm wondering, how much do you see, this broader conversation, whether it's Farhad Manjoo putting out a great New York Times article, like, do you see that helping you in your conversations across the state?
For sure. I mean, everything that's happening nationally helps to make the case that what we're doing is not so radical. It's not going to, cause town X to implode. It's happening in Massachusetts too. So the Sacramento reforms were really interesting. And Massachusetts, our neighboring state, just 2 weeks ago, a Republican governor signed into law the transit-oriented development bill that enables more housing within a half mile of transit. And that's what we're proposing here. So Connecticut has no statewide rules on ADUs. We're proposing that this half mile TOD. It's different than the Massachusetts proposal, but it's essentially the same concept. Main Street zoning. I mean, we're putting together a series of things that other places have done in some form or fashion. We're not to Oregon's level yet. We're not to every single family in certain towns is a fourplex. We're not there yet politically. That maybe we are, but I don't know for sure that we are. But I know for sure that we have a good shot at having some of the reforms that we've been proposing. So
Yeah, I mean, and being able to build, that broad-based coalition and keeping that coalition together, I think that's something that, California sort of vacillates between having a coalition and a circular firing squad, that you end up with, how much are, especially, I mean, having labor fully sign on to your reforms is like a really exciting thing for me, because like labor recently killed a bill to allow affordable housing to get built faster, right? So it's kind of this, coalitions get really complicated. So I'm very excited to hear that you're getting the carpenters on board with a broader aspect of like the entire package of bills.
yeah, well, we're excited about it.
I don't know if you want to, but you maybe highlight the positive, but sort of what are challenges that you're facing in pulling together that coalition?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of any coalition is that some people will say we have to go way farther, and some people will say, oh no, you've gone too far. And so far we've kept, I think, more or less the train on the track with different trade-offs, and really it's coming down to, if we do this in this area, and your concern is offsetting, we have actually the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities on board with our coalition, and they've already signed off on 3 of our major proposals, I believe, and we're meeting with them before we put the final bill out. So we have the town's concerns, we have home builders, we have environmental groups, we have some of the major affordable housing advocates, like a great group called Partnership for Strong Communities, which does a lot of education of legislators, but also does affordable housing policy in many different respects. So we have a very credible group. And again, the way that we've been trying to thread many needles is to say, this was your concern last session. Here's what these guys want, and so how do we kind of figure out how to get something that everybody has consensus on? And we're hoping that it stays together, and that we don't have, again, another issue with any coalition is they'll say, okay, well, maybe I can get to my legislator to tweak this little provision, and then it sort of unravels. And so we really need that discipline to carry forward over the next 12 weeks or 16 weeks to try to get it to the finish line, but we're hopeful.
So there are a lot of different kinds of policies that kind of thwart housing production and that thwart, building multifamily kinds of housing. I know that you are passionate about parking and how it is, parking requirements often are used as a way to thwart, especially, all different kinds of housing. But I just want to open the door. I have a lot of parking rants. I want to open the door to your parking rants about how parking requirements are thwarting housing goals all over the place.
Yeah. So back to Hartford, Hartford is a very historic city with lots of great architecture built over 100 years ago. Much of our city was built over 100 years ago. So what did we not have 100 years ago? We didn't have cars. Some of our most charming neighborhoods are neighborhoods without excessive parking around the housing. If you go to the period of Hartford that was built in the 1960s through really through 2000, you have a complete change in building type and you have a complete change in environment. You have a very car-oriented strip mall type, gas station, car wash, used car lot type of development. And so the question is, what kind of city, should Hartford be? What kind of city do we want to live in? And the truth is, we got it right 100 years ago. I'm also a preservationist. I just stepped down from Preservation Connecticut, which is all of the preservation in New England, very representative of that. But Preservation Connecticut is, a great model of an organization that's embraced preservation and housing, and looking at the whole picture. And I think that's been a great evolution for that particular organization over time, and a model for other preservation groups. But anyway, back to parking. So in Hartford, I chaired the Planning and Zoning Commission here for 7 years, and I just stepped down over the summer. I don't even know is it January? Yes, so last summer. And one of the most important things we did, I think, was that we eliminated all minimum parking requirements citywide. So Buffalo's eliminated them for 5,000 square feet uses or less. Hartford just said, pull off the Band-Aid, we're not having minimum parking requirements. We set maximums instead, and we also set minimum bike parking, long-term and short-term storage requirements. So we hope that it's a kind of a radical move, but we hope that that'll turn the city around. Now, we're not advocating as Desegregate Connecticut for that kind of reform. We think every city every large city for sure should be doing that in Connecticut. But we're not advocating for that. We're just asking for communities, for towns to stop their parking mandates that are more than one space for a studio or one bedroom, or two spaces for a 2 or more bedroom. In addition to that, we're saying in these transit-oriented development and Main Street communities where you're really building in an area that's right in areas where you already have services, that we would suggest that the towns have no minimum parking requirement. Will people who are building in these areas probably still want parking? Sure, but it's not the town that's going to mandate that parking. So it's a baby step. Less than 1% of land would be affected by the Main Street and TOD proposals. But we think that without the minimum parking provision, a lot of that land won't be able to be developed for housing, because given the small lots that are around train stations and our main streets in Connecticut, those can be easily eaten up by parking requirements that a city might impose or town might impose. So it's an important part of our platform. Again, for me, it's a no-brainer. We should just go to zero. I can't think of a situation other than a car lot, commercial car sales lot, where you would need a certain number of parking spaces on site. But that's my bias, and I recognize not everybody is there.
Well, so for people who aren't there, can you help us connect this idea? I mean, I live and breathe the watching sort of the parking obsession cause people to say and it ends up in a circular logic that oh, if we build this, everyone's going to be driving. And so we need a lot of parking spots, and therefore then you end up with really car-centric infrastructure, and then everyone has to drive everywhere, and you're pushing, you're increasing sprawl. Map out for people, why should we be on this anti-parking war?
Yeah, so Norman Garrick, who is a colleague of mine, is professor of engineering. His work, it's Garrick. His work really emphasizes this. He's studied Connecticut cities, Hartford, Bridgeport, as compared to Cambridge, Massachusetts, which does not really have onerous minimum parking requirements, and just shown how much of our towns are given over to cars. That research is really groundbreaking, and it's been going on for some time, so there's many papers about it. But it suggests that more parking requirements, more parking that is provided, leads to more driving. So if more parking equals more driving, why are we providing any parking at all? It's driving that's killing us, not just because of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also literally killing us, hitting pedestrians. I have a law review paper out about that on SSRN. It's called Rules of the Road, if anybody is super interested in that. But yeah, cars are a scourge on our society, modern society. Now, again, am I going to impose my own views, statewide? No, but we've gotten unanimous consent here in Hartford to that. And we hope, at least by including this in our proposals and starting the conversation, that more towns will say, why do we require that? There's plenty of towns that don't. And again, they have not imploded.
So this is one thing that you know, and especially like, I mean, California is even more car centric than Connecticut, and so I'm deep in the car conversation kind of all the time. And one thing that I think is really, I understand a lot and have a lot of empathy for, is that we're sort of living in this like post-car world where, especially when you see people unable to live close to jobs and opportunity, the people who need access to the jobs and opportunity there are being forced to be in cars in order to get there and back. And I see a lot of people making this like really like difficult to continue to process, but like you have to engage with it, of an equity argument for continuing to have as much car-centric infrastructure as we do, because people are already needing to drive in to get access to those places. And it becomes this like self-reinforcing argument that is really hard to break, and to figure out how do we get out of that and say, okay, we're just going to totally rethink our society. And you can get into like, people are going to be like, well, I still need to drive to this place. Are you just going to like take my car and take my parking spot, and then I'm never going to be able to get out? Now you've created a double, and this is where urbanists like can become like, jerks, right? I think it's like, how do we talk about this in a way that helps people get on board with this idea of transforming society without hurting people who have to live in the system that we currently have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the problem. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. And the question is do we want to be people whose primary goal is to figure out where our cars that we do not use 95% of the day go? Do we want our whole social structure and our whole environment to be dictated based on that? Or do we want to actually plan for people? And I again, whether it's a wealthy town, it's a rural town, it's an urban town, there's not a good case that's made for the arbitrary parking requirements that we have. We have towns in Connecticut, some of the wealthiest towns, requiring 3 parking spaces for 1 studio apartment. So what does that do to the cost of the apartment building? The apartment or the building as a whole? Of course, it makes it higher. Of course, it keeps people out. And of course, it prevents that development from ever actually happening, because you have to devote more land to the use than to more paving to the use, and you have to get a larger parcel of land than you would have if you do otherwise. I have there's a New Canaan realtor, I believe, in the chat, who's been on multiple calls today, and I guess I would say there are towns like New Canaan, just to address that town in particular. New Canaan, 31% of New Canaan is zoned for 4-acre zoning. I mean, that's great, and it's good for watershed protection. It's good in some ways. But on the other hand, what you're creating, and again, the conversation that I had earlier today with the Norwalk River Watershed Association was all about how what we're forcing in our land use laws is the use of the car, is people going further out. And until this recent, the pandemic, a lot of that housing was not desirable. So people in New York have scooped up some of the houses near New York City. But on the other hand, in a normal market, those are not really, it's not the way people want to live anymore. So if our zoning laws lock in these outdated car-centric, modes, it makes it really challenging to find inclusionary places in towns that you really could. There really are lots of opportunities to do that in even the wealthiest towns in Connecticut. And I think that many people believe that there's a chance.
Yeah, I think, part of this is also just like hope in some ways. I really have a lot of empathy, especially when you're talking about historically disinvested in neighborhoods and communities, and who are often coming at the discussions about housing and land use and sort of all of these conversations from such a place of loss and such a place of like, whether it's mass displacement, whether it's knowing that there are communities who have school districts that are performing really, there's just such a sense of denial and lack of access that I really understand. Like, how do you sort of paint this picture? I look, when I first talked to some people about how we were like, for instance, going to sue the suburbs and mandate that they build their fair share of affordable and multifamily housing. One of my first interactions with somebody who's like a longtime equity activist, and I won't name names because since they've been like, okay, well, yeah, fine, you actually did it. But like, they laughed in my face. They were like, yeah, fucking right. And like, even if you did, like, these communities have been screwing over, the low income communities for a really long time. And I don't believe that we're actually going to, let's say, desegregate Connecticut. And getting people to be like, actually, we can just change these policies. Like, I have bougie friends who live in New Canaan, and like, I am excited about the idea that they're going to have to think about like, oh, like workforce housing and like building a lot and like opening that community to be more accepting. Cause I think people want to believe that their community is welcoming, and they don't necessarily realize how the zoning is really like creating those barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I guess your question is really, well, let me just say that, we have found that people in every community, all of the communities and some of the communities that you might think, oh, well, that's not a place I would have thought is welcoming, have really started to turn the page. Many people participated in Black Lives Matter marches. Many people have seen, on video this year and through the coronavirus pandemic and the eviction crisis, just the stark inequities. And I do think that people are changing their minds and moving forward. But of course, there are always going to be people who are stuck in the past and stuck in just mindsets that you just can't change them. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who are moving towards, what can I do? And our goal as an organization has been to connect for people the outcomes that we all know, or that all decent people know are unfair, and connect those with specific kinds of policies. I mentioned the zoning atlas, which is coming out hopefully, like I said, on Monday, early next week. But it really starkly illustrates the kinds of opportunities that are available. And so I had pulled up that statistic just while you had been talking. 31% is zoned for this. I mean, we have statistics for every single town and every single place and how they're zoned. And when that comes out, you'll just really be able to see, plain as day, how towns have done their zoning and what that has produced. We'll put in our atlas income levels of the city, racial and ethnic background makeup. You really be able to see zoning and outcomes. And, not everybody's going to go through 178 actually zoning jurisdictions in the state, because we have sub-municipal zoning actually in 11 places. So again, not everybody's going to go through each and every item, but if you do, if you just go through a few, you'll see that there's a huge connection between certain zoning policies and the ability to create wealth and the ability to have access to opportunity.
Yeah, I hope, right, that you're right, that we're getting to this next phase where people are ready to say, okay, I'm bought on. I believe systemic racism exists. I can tell that, this town is exclusionary. And then all you have to do is paint the picture of like, this is the policy, the invisible policy that you can't, this zoning is this thing that, people see the results of the housing and they think that it's like organic.
Handed down from God. They think it's handed down from God. Like, oh, well, this is how it is. Actually, that's what I say. And I said it, earlier today when I was talking with the Norwalk group, which was great, actually, because it encompasses an area of Connecticut that's suburban and wealthy and large lot zoning and so on. But the link between environmentalism and zoning was really important to them. But again, it's like a light bulb goes, every presentation I have, I say, the zoning was not preordained. It wasn't something that was in the Bible. It wasn't something that, we sort of, that sprang out of human, our brain, I mean, sprang out of our brain. I mean, it didn't, it's not part of the natural order of life, right? I mean, it is something that we can change, and actually changing it is not going to result in bad places. It's not going to result in crime. It's certainly not going to result in school overcrowding. It's going to result in, I mean, again, if you go on our website in the FAQs page, in our data page, you'll see, that in many cases, multifamily housing has led to higher home values because people like to have diverse options in their communities. So if you kind of go back and just say, okay, where did this come from? Where did zoning come from? We made it, and often we made rules in periods of time when we thought communities thought that they should exclude certain groups, or that maybe this wasn't the time to have X, Y, or Z, and so they made them tighter. And what's been happening in communities in Connecticut and all over the country is people have just made zoning rules tighter, and so local governments have clamped down on what people can do and create in their properties. And that has resulted in this, I guess my old professor, Bob Ellickson, calls it a zoning straitjacket. He studied New Haven, he studied San Francisco Bay Area, he studied Austin, Texas, and he found that Connecticut has by far the most restrictive zoning, and he called it a straitjacket, which I think is an apt term. And so the point of our zoning reforms is really to take advantage of the conversation and say, look, let's try to loosen some of that. Let's try to, this isn't about local control. This is about, homeowners. It's about, yes, in my backyard, but it's also about homeowners being able to carve out an ADU. It's about neighborhoods being able to become more diverse, which everybody, again, any decent person knows we need that in the state, and we should strive for that.
I think it's, fear is something that and especially in this thinking about making urbanism anti-racist, and the fear that people have about their communities changing is something that I think we have a lot of different conversations about. When do you bring that conversation and have it head on? When do you have somebody who has sort of like, people have amorphous kind of fluffy ideas about housing. They haven't really sort of pinned them down. And how much are you triggering sometimes, implicit bias in a lot of these cases that people will say like, oh, I don't want crime in my community. That's something that we hear a lot about, right? Oh, I don't want to bring downtown into my community. And I think one thing that's very powerful about your branding is that you're setting it up to say, I know what you're talking about, right? You're talking about perpetuating segregation, and we're talking about ending that, and sets you up to have a conversation potentially about their fears a little bit earlier. I don't really have a question there. I just think that it's a very powerful.
I think it's a good observation that there is a lot of fear, and of course there is, because people, when they can get to the point where they can purchase a home, which is not everybody. Home ownership rates in Hartford are, I should have the number handy, but in some neighborhoods it's low as 11%. So, and that's certainly not the case in even our neighboring suburbs. But you look at it when somebody does get to the point where they can buy their home, of course they have some concerns about, is this going to affect my property value? What the reforms that we're proposing are intended to help a town build a tax base and to create and generate economic activity at very minimal change to any other part of town. We're not touching large lot zoning in our proposals, at least not at this point. We're not kind of tackling some of the bigger things. We're actually going for the things that are consensus but high impact and low cost to towns, and actually probably mostly a pretty significant benefit. I mean, we've had studies of Connecticut housing market that shows if you create 1,500 units of multifamily housing in the state, you generate millions in tax revenues for state and local governments, which can be used to do something cool, and that you generate jobs, you generate income for people, that's not just one-time construction jobs, but that goes over time. But certainly, back to your question about the fear, certainly there's a fear. And so the only thing we can do, we can't, address everybody's sort of, everything they bring to the conversation, but we can show them in a very practical and pragmatic way. Look, this is the research that's been done. There's not an increase in crime. There's not, X, Y, and Z, these other things you're concerned about. And we put that actually all in our FAQs page and sprinkled throughout our website. Here's a link to this study. Here's a link to that study. On the other hand, you can't convince people, not everybody with simply studies and facts. Some people are just going to be where they are. I did want to, there's a question here about the quiet corner. So this is somebody who knows Connecticut. The Quiet Corner is one of the most rural areas in Connecticut, and you might think it's one of the most conservative and might have, just these sort of embedded fears about what might happen. One of the first members of our coalition was actually the Northeast Council of Governments, which represents the Quiet Corner. And some of our most vocal supporters and thinkers in this movement have come from the Quiet Corner. So it's a very rural, again, very rural part of the state. I dare say it's a fairly white part of the state, but very mixed in terms of its income levels in different communities in that corner. But again, it goes to show that the movement that we're trying to build, and the movement that any state coalition should try to build, really has to take, it has to be able to talk with all people, and we're really grateful that the Quiet Corner is well represented in what we're doing. Even though they're small in population, they're really emblematic of a type of Connecticut community that we think is very important to ensuring that what we're trying to do is successful in all kinds of communities.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Rudy to moderate Q&A. And I want to encourage, I saw questions go by in the chat window, but please definitely copy and paste them into the Q&A section so Rudy can try and pull out whatever we're going to get to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Very, very interesting. So there was someone who asked a question earlier on, and when you opened up, you said you were a good zoning advocate. So do you prefer comprehensive zoning or form-based zoning? Or do you recommend a different approach?
Oh, this is a great idea. So a great question. So in Hartford, when we redid our zoning code, we went to an entirely citywide form-based code. And actually earlier, or just last year, we got a Best Zoning Code Award from the Form-Based Codes Institute and Smart Growth America. So we were really proud of that because, again, it was unanimous. We threw out the old code entirely. We adopted a new code in one night. The consultant said she'd never seen that before, but the reason that we were able to do that is because first of all, we're all about robust consensus building. We met with neighborhood leaders, again and again about zoning, but also the form-based code was a tool that would help neighborhoods figure out what kind of development they liked best and make sure that the neighborhood that kind of stuck to that development. Now, again, Hartford is a city that's maybe unlike some of the cities that you all work in. It's a fairly low income city, but it also is a city with a high opportunity for development because we have a large number of vacant lots. We have a large number of parking lots, especially in our downtown. And for us, we really looked at a form-based code as being an important tool to set out the rules in advance and to make all housing in our city as of right, which means it does not go through a public hearing. There is no housing in the city of Hartford that goes through a public hearing process. And the recent housing that has been built and the renovations of industrial buildings and renovations of downtown banks and all of that has been it's been a pleasure to see because of the form-based code. It's high quality housing. It's well situated. It has nice windows. It's well structured. The parking is not dominant, but it has really resulted in very nice outcomes. Of course, now we were stalled during the pandemic, but we're hoping to pick back up again afterward in terms of development. Not every town takes a pro-development approach, but a model form-based code can do wonders in those towns as well. And the main benefit of a form-based code is that it sets out the rules in advance. It has a lot of community engagement in the development of the code, but then after you've done it, somebody can look at the code and say, this is what's required. I'm going to do that. There might be a little negotiation with zoning staff, but it can be approved by staff. So for those places that see housing challenges, housing supply that may be desperately needed, form-based codes are really important. So part of our proposals, just to sum up, is a form-based code that the state develops that towns can take pieces of. So in Hartford, we might have a downtown building type, what we do. We could translate that over to New Haven, to Stamford, and to the other large towns. Meanwhile, Chaplin, where I see one of the attendees is from, is never going to pick that chapter of the form-based code. They'll pick the chapter of probably two-story in the case of Chaplin, Main Street shopping, maybe type areas, but more likely, duplex style housing and how that would have to be built. Because again, Chaplin's a very small town type community. But the idea would be, let's take these things and stop making housing require extensive processes, because we know, well, there's some pretty simple rules as to what kinds of housing we could build, and we can put those in architectural form.
I mean, and we know that the people who are able to engage on project by project nitpicking and jamming things up are people who have a lot of privilege and time on their hands and ability to, I mean, that's, my day to day is a lot of these hearings about, and watch and sort of organizing people to show up at all of these different project by project. It's just such a nightmare when you're making the decisions piecemeal like that. And every project you end up with this like discussion of how does this project solve the entire problems of the entire community, which is just impossible. Like no project is going to solve all of the problems of the entire community.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat a link to our events page and recordings. And you could see a talk about this topic from Catherine Einstein, who studied many decision-making meetings and decision-making in many lots of decision-making with regard to zoning in Massachusetts, and found out a lot about the nature of the decision makers as well as the people who attended meetings. She took their zip codes and was able to extrapolate on the basis of race, age, and gender, and found that largely the decision makers and the commentators were white men in their 50s or older, which, again, shame on the rest of us for not showing up. But who can show up if they have the dog in the background, the kids, multiple jobs, the zoning meetings are at night, and they might not be in places that are accessible by car if you don't have a car.
And hours of meetings. I mean, this is just like, anyway, sorry, Rudy, next question.
Yeah, I know we could talk about this all night. So the next question is, I think a really, really important one, and that we talk about it quite often. So Kristen Hall says, how do you address a question of quote unquote neighborhood character? Lots of people use this vague term as a way to justify that their community shouldn't change. They are often explicitly referring to the size and design of the buildings, but the implication is that it leads to racial outcomes.
Yeah, so you can't legislate for racism. So I mean, I guess the question is how do you get people to change their hearts and minds and to stop imposing ridiculous requirements that may lead to unjust outcomes. What we are doing in our proposal, though, is saying that that the way to define character is only through physical standards. In other words, that there is no, and we would say that towns cannot make decisions on the basis of character unless what they mean by that is architectural character and physical form and site planning requirements. So you're right that even that could result in somebody saying, well, okay, well, the character of my town is everything is single story and, da, 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 and that's just the way it is. And knowing that that's going to, or everything in my town is gilded with gold, so making something so expensive that it'll never, it'll never be built. But again, you can't, there's something, how can you legislate for that? The other thing that our bill proposal does, and I'll try to find the language is, we suggest that we say in state law that no zoning regulations can be applied to deny an application on the basis of immutable characteristics or income levels of any applicant or end user other than age, to the extent age restricted communities are otherwise authorized. So we want to put it very explicitly in the statutes that there have been, and there are zoning commissions that say, it's these people, or, we don't want the welfare recipients in city X to be coming to our town. And people say that, and commissioners say that, which is why we're also advocating for land commissioner training. But we character is a terrible word. And actually, the reasons that the 3 preservation organizations in the state signed on to our language is because they wanted it to be known, back to Preservation Connecticut, Connecticut Main Street Center, and Connecticut Preservation Action. They wanted it to be known that character is not going to be used in their name to inflict racist outcomes on communities. And so again, they're involved in our effort in a way that I don't think that you've seen necessarily in other states, but because they recognize that these are code words a lot of the time, and there's no way to cut it otherwise. But again, you can't legislate for racism. I mean, we have a case here in a suburb. I mean, it's in the court system, but in any case, but I won't name it anyway. But the lawsuit is partly based on the fact that 2 of the commissioners in the last few months have held a meeting where they essentially mocked an immigrant and suggested that whose lawyer said, well, is this person fears for his life because of the zoning violations that he's brought to you before you, and the commissioners joked about deporting him. That was their joke. That was, you can't legislate for that. So anyways, there you go.
Well,
answer,
yeah.
but we're trying.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring a question that just came up recently. I'm going to bring it out because we're running short on time, I think. So Jessica Blatt says, what is your advice for other cities that want to adopt and adapt a coalition like Desegregate Connecticut? What are some of the first steps to take and critical stakeholders to involve?
Okay, so I didn't catch the first part. So, yes. Oh, Philadelphia. Great. Okay, so I love Philadelphia. Philadelphia and Hartford share a lot in common. And actually, Philadelphia has undertaken its own zoning reforms that have been really important. So kudos to Philadelphia and all that you're doing there. I mean, for a place like Philadelphia, you already have a very strong real estate development community. You have a strong historic preservation community, and they often butt heads. I think you have affordable housing advocates. You really have all the players that you would have in a large city. I guess it depends on what it is you would like to do. So I believe that Center City in Philadelphia has been significantly rezoned to allow more as of right housing and to allow more conversions. The extent to which that reaches the outlying suburbs, if that's your target, I think is probably maybe part of your question. So I guess it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to continue what's happening in Center City outward to other Philadelphia neighborhoods, that's one question. But on the other hand, if you're also thinking about the outlying suburbs beyond, I think a key factor is getting people in those suburbs to start having conversations. A great model for this, it comes from Darien, Connecticut, which is I would say a wealthy suburb outside of New York City, and an amazing 20. I think he said today he was on another call with me. A 25-year-old named Chris Jansen and the former housing commissioner Yvonne Klein have convened a series of conversations, and they're called Darien Talks. They're great. You should listen in if you're interested in reaching into suburban areas. But it's community conversations from within, led by people who just really care, and they've been attracting more and more people, and I think really getting the conversation started there. So that may be another way to approach this.
I want to add in one thing that I think is really interesting as sort of different and looking at different ways people are doing it across the country. We see there's a model of reforming existing coalitions and getting partners to think differently about the housing issue. And I think Desegregate Connecticut is a great example of like bringing these different coalition partners in and reframing how they're thinking and talking about the issue and getting them on board with a campaign. There are also places where you needed to bring a new voice to the conversation. And I think that's where like the YIMBY movement is like, okay, we need somebody to be explicitly talking about like housing consumer, right? And to form a consumer activist group that is the voice of the people who are saying we need the housing. I want a freaking apartment. And that's, I think, one thing that the YIMBY, you know, if you're wanting to like form, you know, a consumer advocate organization of your YIMBY club, you know, we can help you get that started. We have a whole toolkit for launching those organizations. If you're in a position to do that kind of restructuring existing coalitions work, that is so powerful because you're starting with organizations that have political power already. I think that's like, they're just different ways of sort of attacking that political problem.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So from Bill Cooney, he says, what is your organization's relationship like with city planners? Are they supportive or do they tend to be hesitant to adopt your policy proposals? And I'm asking that because I know there are planners in this call, so that'd be relevant.
Yeah, so I'll drop in the chat a link to our coalition. So you might be surprised to see, in addition to the organizations I've mentioned, the municipalities, the 3 preservation groups, the Trust for Public Land, you'll see the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, the Connecticut chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and the Connecticut chapter of Landscape Architects. And again, these are 3 professional groups that as institutions have recognized their role explicitly. This is why they joined. They recognize their role in perpetuating racism. The planners have been particularly helpful. Well, they've all been amazing. The planners have been helpful on technical expertise. The Association of Zoning Enforcement Officers, separate from the planners, has also combed through our draft bills and said, okay, this will work, this will work. This is how a zoning officer would read this, and so on. The landscape architects have been doing their part. The AIA has been running a diversity, equity, and inclusion series and including us in everything that they can. So it's just been really heartening that our professionals have come together. And, you know, I thought, I'm a member of the AIA as an architect. You know, I thought, okay, I've got to bring these guys along kicking and screaming, but no, they were, again, one of the first groups to join. So we're just lucky, I guess. I don't know. But we really have come to what we're doing with taking everybody in and saying, look, this is our problem. In fact, we architects, we lawyers, we planners, city planners have created the problem, so we got to fix it.
All right, I think we have just enough time for one more question. The question is, I don't know who sent it, as anonymous. Richard Florida and other economists have discovered that denser housing doesn't always drive down the price of housing. In fact, it can lead to gentrification and increasing housing costs. If upzoning doesn't always make housing more affordable, what are other ways to help desegregate cities?
Yeah, so I mean, we have in our sort of platform 3 organizing principles: housing diversity, which means more different kinds of housing supply, which means creating more housing across the board, and process improvement, which is really about creating better processes for decision making. Again, not putting it in the back end, you know, public hearing, emotional sense, but putting it really at the beginning in areas where we know that we really can say, you know, it's time that we need to do this. But excuse me. To answer the question about supply, though, it's really, I mean, so it's really true that the more supply, it's a Econ 101, the more supply you have, the lower the price will be. If you look at New York City right now during the pandemic, prices are low. It's a renter's market. It's a buyer's market because there's so much supply. You know, nobody ever thought this would happen. Nobody ever thought prices on Upper West Side condos would you know, plummet as they have, but or that apartment buildings downtown would be so cheap. I mean, they're coming with all kinds of amenities, free months rent. You know, I'm not to say that the type of housing doesn't matter, the density doesn't matter, but the fact that there is so much housing on the market and so much to choose from has made a difference for prices. So just taking that big picture, you know, the question of density. Of course, you know, some density, desirable density in your train stations might not be affordable to everybody. One of the reasons why we've put in our proposals a 10% affordability requirement for any building over 10 units. So if a town chooses to, and we hope they will, zone for 10+ unit housing, every unit above 10 would have to be affordable. So, just taking all of that, together is just to say, we are big believers in creating more housing, period, more housing opportunities, dividing up the large houses we have into accessory dwelling units for environmental reasons, but also for just the opportunity reasons, and so on. So we're big believers in supply.
I'm going to do, just to end there, YIMBY Action, if you're wanting to hear more about sort of our policy framework as well, I highly recommend checking out the YIMBY Action Core 4. And that's where we sort of lay out what's the sort of comprehensive, I mean, everything has more nuance, and in housing, you can always go down the rabbit hole of wonkery, and there's more nuance and more nuance and more nuance. But the big picture for us is that Core 4 of upzoning, especially the wealthiest, most exclusionary communities, and streamlining permitting so that housing actually gets built, more money for subsidized affordable housing, and fixing some of the bad incentives that make it hard for communities to say yes to housing. I think let's end it there. Any last thoughts?
No, just it's so fun to get to other states. I see Kirk from Utah, and Philadelphia, and so it's just really fun. We're doing it at something on next Thursday night with Open New York and Abundant Housing Massachusetts, a happy hour. You're very welcome. Anybody is welcome to attend, no matter what state you're from. And I hope you do check out our zoning atlas if you'd like to sign up for a mailing list. We do something once a week, maybe twice a week at most. We're happy to have you. So have a great night. So thanks again.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank you.